Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 25th of March 2024. Let's get straight to the front line via the key to my map. If you don't know what the lines mean, please pause the video. Okay, we have essentially what we've seen over the last few days, which is no change to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea. Not a lot of change there, although it's quite active around the Terny-Torska neck of the woods there, quite literally that neck of the woods. So there is activity there. It is fairly dynamic, but no changes to the mapping in the last 24 hours. There's quite a lot of activity, I think, going around Bilohorivka and on the Seversk front line, but it's Bakhmut mainly, Ivanytska towards Chasiv Yar. It is Avdiivka, and then it is Novomykhailivka and Marinka sort of area there. Marinka, Krasnohorivka. So those are the three main parts of the front line that are seeing activity that is changing the control maps. No changes to the south and to the Dnipro River at the moment. Thank you to JR who's done the mapping. And also, I'm going to show you another map, but I'll wait till we get to... Well, in fact, we might as well go there now. So we're going to bypass that which is going on in the northeastern axis. As you can see, the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank here, having the shortest paragraph for that entire northeastern axis that I've seen possibly since the beginning of the war for an awful long time now. Anyway, we'll go to Bakhmut, and here the ISW says Russians recently made confirmed advances northwest and southwest of Bakhmut amid continued positional fighting near Bakhmut on March the 24th. Geolocated footage published yesterday indicates that the Russian forces recently advanced south of Bodanivka and north of Klishchivka. So just to remind you where that is on the map, so we're going to come now to Bakhmut, and we have Bodanivka there, south of Bodanivka, and north of Klishchivka, which is exactly where the ISW is indicating activity is. So it might be that Ivanytska, well, still unsure as to how far the Russians have pushed through Ivanytska. Surat Maps has them controlling the whole of it. Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Map having them controlling still half of it. No changes to those maps from what happened yesterday when Surat Maps showed that huge change. Some slight changes up here, and I think that is probably on the nose there. Actually, Surat Maps catching up with Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Map in that particular area south of Bodanivka. And then we have this area north of Klishchivka. I was talking about this yesterday, about how there is this real threat with Russia taking the high grounds north of Ivanytska, and then if they take Ivanytska, then that leaves this whole area north of Klishchivka or northwest of Klishchivka really in the hands of the Russians, and they would take that, and then Klishchivka would fall. And basically, it's almost as if Ivanytska is a bit of a keystone with regards to the rest of this area to the east of the canal. So if you remember, you've got the canal coming on. Let's just zoom in a tiny bit here. You've got the canal, which is so important as a natural barrier that comes all the way up here and here over up through Chasiv Yar, really, or through the outskirts of Chasiv Yar to its east. And I have a feeling that essentially Russia is going to eventually be in control of all this land. I can't tell you what time frame that will be, but it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to all of this area south of Ivanytska if they lose Ivanytska, which it appears that they have done. It just makes much of the rest of the area quite difficult to maintain control of, and especially when you have to supply all of these areas across the canal, it's just difficult. So I foresee the Russians having success up to that canal. Let's go and look at some of the sources. Here we have, although no report says this is Terny-Yampolivka, a Russian mechanized attack being recently repelled in Crimea area. Actually, the geolocation shows it not to be. So Blinska here showing it's actually in the Klishchivka area where the Russian assault gets shelled and stopped. But if you're Surat Maps, you're going to have that being the case of Russians controlling that ground, whether they really do or not. And indeed, that's exactly what we see. So Ukrainians shelling Russian assault in that position has Surret maps claiming the Russians control all of that. So as you can see, previously the lines were back here. So we're seeing a considerable amount of land suddenly being taken and the Russians having control of it, when actually what you're seeing is a Russian mechanized attack being repelled. Part of the course, oops, sorry, I keep doing that. Part of the course, but to be honest, I'm going to go through that at the end of the video. But of course, it's just frustrating. And then it gets almost sort of justified that Surret Maps does that, because the Russians eventually do end up, because they're pushing forward westwards fairly consistently, they'll probably end up taking that land. And then Surret Maps says, well, I was right. Of course, they weren't right. It was, the control wasn't at that point. The control comes later once they do 2 or 3 attacks, and then, eventually the Russians move forward and consolidate that control, and then the Ukrainians pull back. But of course, that eventuality doesn't justify the early claims. But that's what appears to happen. Anyway, that frustrates me, and I think it frustrates Andrew Perpetua as well. Right. So that's what's happening in the Bakhmut area. There's a bit of a rejig here, as I believe some bit of data has come out to show that actually the Russians weren't that far forward in that area between Klishchiivka and Ivanyivka. So I want to show you another map that JR's put me onto. This is the Institute for the Study of War map, but a 3D map. Now, the caveats for this map is that they have accentuated the terrain by 300%. So when I do the zooming in on, say, Ivanyivka, and I've done this repeatedly recently, so I can go in. This is a 1-to-1 kind of iteration of the terrain here, where we have what it would actually look like if you were down there, except it's Google rendering that from a 2D map and turning it into a 3D map. So that's why there's sorts of kind of issues with the way it does that, but it's a nice little in between, I guess. And then this kind of map is a what I'm going to do, by the way, is I'm going to turn on primary and secondary roads and also railroads. It looks a bit chaotic for the time being, but actually when you get down into the nitty gritty, they obviously become less prevalent, but I think they're useful to have on there. Anyway, this is Bakhmut, and where we were talking about just then, I think this is the Kromova road here, so we want to go, that's Chaziv Yar, this is Ivanyivka here, so that's the road coming through Ivanyivka. I think if we go to here, come out of my map, turn it back to north, there we go. So you've got that road coming around through the north of Ivanyivka and doglegging back to the west there, and that is this road here. So let's go in and look at this, and we'll do the whole 3D thing, and hopefully I can make sense of this. So now, as you can see here, it is highly accentuated, and that is useful for some reasons and not so useful in terms of understanding the kind of realism of it there. But you have Ivanyivka, and then you have Bodanivka, and if we come left here, we have Chaziv Yar just in this kind of area. This is Chaziv Yar there. So this map, I think, is really useful, even though it is accentuated to 300% the actual height, but it gives you a kind of quite nice sense of the 3D topography, and can highlight where the Russians or Ukrainians might have particular advantages in certain places. So I've been talking about how this area to the north here, these fields just on top of this hill to the north of Ivanyivka allow the Ukrainians to have, or did allow the Ukrainians to have, the sight over Ivanyivka and allow them to shoot and take out the Russians who are advancing through Ivanyivka. But here we can see that with the Russians taking control of that high ground, it then becomes very difficult for the Ukrainians to really maintain control over Ivanivska. Anyway, that's just looking at that map. I will try and get try and use this more often. It's a little bit more difficult to navigate around. It doesn't have the same controls as the Google map. I might show you. I guess Bilahorivka is quite, I think, a useful place for showing you 3D topography, because there's some quarries and whatnot around there. So I'll just get that ready for that area. So here we are. We're going to go just north of Bakhmut in this area. We're going to go up to Bilahorivka, just on my map, just to let you know where that is. Just because it's good to just get a topographical understanding of what's going on. That's the quarry area, Bilahorivka, just south of Kreminna, south of Serebryansky Forest. And that's where we're going to go just here, where you've got the quarry and whatnot. We go down, and then remember again that this is sort of accentuated by a good deal here, but you can kind of get a sense of how important the terrain is possibly for the different sides, and for the Russians to be coming in from the east here. They have to negotiate getting over the river over here, or at least some kind of gorge, then coming up on the high ground, which they have done of late. But then it's about fighting over Bilahorivka that's in this dip. You've got the quarry here that has very high ground, particularly to the east, and they'd have to negotiate all of this challenging topography in order to try and take Bilahorivka and then move up the high ground. And the Ukrainians, I mean, this would become a kill box really for either side actually. So this, I would imagine, would remain a kind of grey zone. Meanwhile, you've got the river over here. So if you can see, I've shown this plenty of times on the other map, but it is, remember, accentuated by 300%. But the Russians would really struggle moving through the forest, getting their equipment across several routes of this river, and then up the other side of the river onto the high ground there. So fairly useful map there. I think I might dip into this when I want to look at particular elements of the topography. But for the time being, let's now move south of Bakhmut to show you what's going on in Avdiivka. No changes to the mapping anywhere north of Avdiivka. It's just this area around Tonyenka particularly. Even Orlivka and Berditshiya seem to have calmed down a little bit as the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians almost entirely to the river along there. Possibly this area where the Ukrainians are still holding out north of Semenivka. If we go to the Institute for the Study of War, we can see that geolocated footage published yesterday indicates that Russian forces recently made confirmed advances west of Tonyenka. Geolocated footage published yesterday indicates that Ukrainian forces maintain positions near or on the western outskirts of Orlivka, and despite recent Russian claims of Russian advances west of Avdiivka. So that's interesting. A Ukrainian military officer operating in the Avdiivka direction stated that Russian assaults in the Avdiivka direction have become less intense, and that Russian forces have increased their use of reconnaissance drones in that direction. So a few sources to look at concerning those claims. Just to remind you, the claim is that the Ukrainians might still actually hold some positions to the west of Orlivka, which I think is quite significant if it is indeed to the west of the river area, and that the Russians are moving west of Tonyenka, which is something I've been talking about, us expecting that the Russians could fill in this whole area there with control, considering it's between sort of two rivers. I don't know how well defended that will continue to be. But let's look at Orlivka area. But after we go to Suryak maps that talks about that area just north of there, the Russians having some success. So that's this area north of Tonyenka. We won't talk about the other area just yet, but it's just this bit north that I want to mention. So that the Russian army made advances, continuing to advance from the northern plantations after the capture of Tonyenka. And we'll go to the rest of that in a second. Now, Avdiivka, Tonyenka, this is part of the geolocation that the ISW are talking about. active hostilities in the Avdiivka direction, obviously. Attack of the Russian armed forces by armored vehicles west of Tonyanka. Shelling of a tank of the Russian armed forces by an FPV drone of the armed forces of Ukraine. So here we have a tank, which, I mean, this could essentially be anywhere, and it wouldn't really, as long as it isn't too far to the west of the front lines, then I assume, yeah, this is exactly what we'd expect. A tank there getting shelled by an FPV drone or attacked by an FPV drone right on the front line there near to the west of Tonyanka. But it shows that it does tell us that the Russians are attacking west of Tonyanka. They are also, according to all the mappers, moving westerly and having continued control west of Tonyanka. So that's what that shows us. And then we have the 2nd Mechanized Battalion near the 3rd Assault Brigade storms the Russian position in Orlivka. And this supposedly suggests, I mean, again, it depends on the time frame really, but it suggests that the Ukrainians are still fighting to the west of Orlivka. And let's plug that one into the map. Yeah, so that's well within Orlivka, and that surprises me. And again, you know, if the ISW is saying that geolocated footage shows that they maintain positions near or on the western outskirts of Orlivka, published on the 24th, I wonder whether that is really from the last day or two, or whether that's outdated footage. Might have been published on the 24th, but we can't tell exactly when it was recorded. And I would be surprised if the Ukrainians were still fighting within that area. So I would take that with a pinch of salt. And then we go further south from there. So right now, let's go back to what the ISW, not the ISW, Surat maps were saying for the rest of the claims around here. So that's the idea that Ukrainians might have pushed back in this area of Pervomaisky. It says the Russian army made small advances inside Pervomaisky, so that's this part of Pervomaisky, adjacent to the church, while they continue to advance west of Tonyanka. On the other hand, Russian troops failed to consolidate the control over Perekrovsk petrol station and retreated to the dam of Avdiivka pond. Now, this, I think, wasn't the Russians failing to consolidate and being pushed back. I don't think they ever properly took control of this, and I think this is again another example of Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Map being somewhat more conservative, particularly Andrew, with his mapping, not saying that even if the Russians set foot in somewhere, that it doesn't mean they control it, and being more conservative. Surat Maps throwing in Russian control here, and then a day or two later, there's solid video evidence to suggest that Russians don't control that area, and hence walking that back, but talking more about, you know, selling it in terms of more that the Ukrainians are pushing back rather than the Russians never really took it. And then some slight gains for the Russians over here in Pervomaisky that wouldn't surprise me at all, probably is the case. Right, then we come on further down south to past Krasnohorivka and Marinka, and actually coming down to this area just north of Novomykhailivka, where you can see that all the mappers agree that there is at least some change to the mapping here, with some pretty large changes for Andrew Perpetua, showing that Russians have pushed right up here, and that's in agreement with what Surat Maps has said in the area. Agreement actually in this northerly area, as Surat Maps shows some gains there too. We look on Surat Maps' piece here, you can see some fairly substantial gains there. Situation southwest of Donetsk. In the last 4 days, Russian army has continued advancing in the plantations north of Novomykhailivka, heading to the town from this axis. Meanwhile, inside the town, troops secured the area adjacent to Suki Yali River, while they're trying to expel the Ukrainian army from the neighbouring warehouses. In other words, the Russians are pressuring from this northern area, which was quite well fortified for the Ukrainians, but difficult to hold on as the Russians are pushing from the north and then pushing from the south, sort of everywhere around here, trying to equalise this front line, something like that. Well, I mean, they're really looking at taking Konstantinivka, and that's the importance of holding on to Novomykhailivka, but it is looking increasingly more precarious for the Russians, particularly as, according to Surat Maps, taking control of this area near this river, the Suki Yali River that comes in through there and goes to the north. So taking the land up to that river, you can see it curls around here, and then I presume goes off around there and joins the pond. So the Ukrainians, the Ukraine is ceding territory here to the Russians, but that's according to Syriac maps. There's some very different mapping going on with Andrew Perpetua there. But it seems that Deep State map and Syriac maps broadly agree with the control of at least half of Novomykhailivka there. And that's really it for the map. As mentioned previously, there are no changes to the southern areas. I just pop into the ISW to get a handle on the Novomykhailivka area. Geolocated footage published on the 24th indicates that the Russian forces recently marginally advanced south of Novomykhailivka. So we've just been talking about inside. Now we've got what we have a geolocation to this point, which is described as a destruction of 2 Russian T-80BV tanks with KMT-7 southwest of the village of Novomykhailivka. So the Russians still losing a tremendous amount of equipment in particularly this area. Novomykhailivka has been very expensive for them. So let's geolocate those tanks that have been destroyed. And here we go. Interesting. So that is to the west of the defensive lines. Quite probably an attack that has been repelled, and those tanks have been they're pining for the fjords. They are deceased. They're no longer tanks. Anyway, that's, as mentioned, pretty much that for the mapping. Thanks so much to JL, and thanks to you guys who have supported the channel and continue to watch my stuff. Hopefully this was of use and informative. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.